Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Khaled El-Gindi, and I'm a senior fellow at the Middle East Institute, where I also direct the program on Palestine and Palestinian-Israeli affairs. Very pleased to welcome you all to our webinar this afternoon on the future of Israeli politics in a post-Netanyahu era. Just by way of setting the scene, so at this moment, for the first time in 12 years, Israel is about to have a prime minister who is not Benjamin Netanyahu. After 4 elections in 2 years, Yair Lapid, head of the centrist Yesh Atid party, has managed to cobble together a pretty extraordinarily diverse coalition for a new so-called change government with 7 other parties, putting an end to the political stalemate of the last 2 years, as well as the 12-year reign of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the longest serving prime minister in Israel's history. Under the terms of the new agreement, the ultra-nationalist Naftali Bennett of the far-right Yamina party will serve as prime minister for the first 2 years of this premiership. And assuming that the coalition holds up that long, he will be rotated out. He will be followed by Lapid, who will serve for the second 2 years. The new change government includes a pretty unlikely and almost surreal set of parties and personalities, ranging from the pro-two-state solution Meretz Party on the left, all the way to the far-right Yamina party, which is pro-annexation and explicitly opposed to a two-state solution, and will, for the first time, include an Arab party, Mansour Abbas's United Arab List, in the ruling coalition. And it's not just any Arab party, but an Islamist party to boot. To help us better understand the situation in Israel and the prospects for this new government and what a post-Netanyahu environment might mean, we've assembled a really excellent panel of experts. I'll introduce them here briefly, but you can find their full bios on the landing page for this event. Keep an eye on the chat, where we'll also be including some links to supplementary information and articles by our panelists. So first, we have Thaher Abu Ras, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland. We also are pleased to have our longtime non-resident scholar, Paul Sham, who is director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland. And last and certainly not least, we'll hear from Dr. Shira Efron, who is Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies in Israel. And Shira is joining us from Tel Aviv. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. The format is going to be a traditional moderated Q&A. I will put questions to the panelists to get the discussion started, but we very much welcome questions from you, our audience, as well. You can submit your question at any time during the discussion using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Be sure to use the Q&A function and not the chat function for your questions. I and the panelists will keep an eye on those questions and try to incorporate as many of them into the discussion as we can. Finally, let me just also note that today's session is being recorded. If you have any technical problems, please put those in the chat box, and our events team will try to address those. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. I'd like to get started with you, Shira, since you're there on the ground in Israel. This new change government, as it's known, pretty much everyone agrees is going to be very, very fragile. And it is set to be sworn in this Sunday. Is that now inevitable? Or are there any sort of last-minute rabbits that Netanyahu can pull out of his hat to keep this from happening? And if assuming the government is sworn in, how durable can this very eclectic bunch of parties be as a government, given that the sole issue that unites them for the moment is more or less their opposition and in some cases hatred of Prime Minister Netanyahu? And if you could, since you are there on the ground in Israel, if you could give us a sense of what the public mood is like going into this new government. Is there a sense of relief? Is it cynicism? Is there nervousness about what might lay ahead? Paint a picture for us if you could.
Sure. Thanks, Khalid, and thank you, everyone, for having me here, for the opportunity. I'm not a prophet. We don't know Netanyahu and a full group of what you would call the Bibis here, right on the ground, can do all sorts of things before Sunday. I will tell you that at INSS, there's going to be a conference Sunday afternoon. We're supposed to have one of the ministers, designated ministers, address the conference. Clearly, because of the swearing in ceremony, they couldn't attend in person, but they promised to send us a video. And today they just panicked and said, like, we don't know what's going to happen until we're sworn in as ministers. We don't want to send any videos. We don't want to embarrass ourselves. We don't know what's going to happen. So it's that fragile, right? And we're getting into the weekend. Friday, Saturday is the weekend here. So it's not done until it's done. I think it's going to happen. That's my sense. There were some reports in the Netanyahu office, around the Netanyahu office, that he's gonna, transition peacefully and quietly. I don't know if we're anticipating a January 6th moment here, right? There's like a lot of the reactions here from the Likud and from Netanyahu himself have been taken directly from the Trump playbook of denying the results, undermining the legitimacy of this newly formed government. So we'll have to see. It's my personal assessment that it will happen. And if not, I just don't see how that gets Netanyahu closer to his goals, right, which are to stay in power, because there'll be elections, but he would just look worse. So I think it's going to happen. How durable this government's going to be, everyone's really skeptical, right? The underlying, I think everyone just goes into this with the assumption that this is a government that can't last. You said correctly, there's Meretz, Labor, Victor Lieberman's, Israel Beitenu party, Gideon Saar, Tikva Hadasha, Ram, Mansour Abbas's party, and Yamina and Yesh Atid. To say this is an unlikely combination is really an understatement. And surely what unites them now is the sort of the to be or not to be question, right? That's what brought them together. I want to say a couple of things about the good thing about this forming coalition. Like on the face of it, right? If you would think you need to form a coalition partner, if you have a government that actually represents the public more broadly, it's theoretically is a good thing. First of all, the first time you have an Arab party in the coalition in a way we haven't seen before. 20, and I'm sure Abbas is going to speak about it, that 21% of the Israeli public are 48 Palestinians. I personally think it's a good thing that they're represented. Left, right, center, this is a good thing. I also need to say that 9 ministers of the 26 are going to be women, which is also unprecedented in Israeli history, which is also like a good thing, right? The bad, obviously, is that they have very big disagreements over ideological issues. I have not seen a coalition agreement, and it could be last minute, wrangling over the agreement, but it could also be a fear of like, what are we getting into? We can't agree on anything. Already we are hearing reports that Merav Michaeli, who's going to slotted to be transportation minister, she wants to reverse a plan that her predecessor, Mir Regev of Likud, for investing 2.5 billion shekels in roads in what they call Judea and Samaria in the West Bank, which obviously serve the settlers. This is a budget that's sort of controlled by the Ministry of Defense. moving slowly with the creeping annexation due to the mandate of a British ministry, and already we're seeing disagreements over this. On the other hand, and it's very hard to say how the interest of the different players could change over time, right? I think now at this moment in time, most players there have an interest in keeping this government intact for over a year. And that's my assessment. I'll start with like Mansour, Abbas, Ram. Over the first year, they're supposed to get budgets. They're supposed to get recognition of some villages in the Bedouin villages in the south. You want to make this happen. Obviously, everyone on the sort of left, you're seeing Meretz, Labor, and Yesh Atid, they want to keep this happening. Also, Yair Lapid is slotted to be prime minister only in 2 years, so he definitely has an incentive. Naftali Bennett himself. Naftali Bennett is now at a very weird place with his base, which is the settler community, going into what they would call a leftist government. And on the other hand, he doesn't have another constituency. He doesn't get the votes of the Tel Aviv sort of crowd, the liberal, the HT, the Meretz Labor. So what he has going for him is a chance to be a really successful prime minister. But to do this, you need some time, right? So we're going July, August, Jewish holidays, September, October. And then Avigdor Lieberman, he's again in a very powerful position, the Minister of Finance, responsible for the budget. And so I could see how he would like to stay in power for longer. So most people I hear are betting like under a year. I actually think that the first year they're going to go through. A lot of it's going to be impacted, but by what's happening in the Likud, because from Gideon Saar's perspective, Tikva Hadasha and Yamina, Naftali Bennett, the big thing is let's take over Likud, or without Netanyahu, we can sit with Likud and replace those left-wing leaning center government parties with Likud, just as long as we don't have Netanyahu there. Will there be a revolt in the Likud? Will Likud kick Bibi out? This is something we're not seeing at the moment, but there's been talks all this time. There are people that are more popular within the primaries of the Likud party itself, but in the public, actually the guy that has most public in public opinion polls, you see the public of the Likud figures after Netanyahu, only second to him is Nir Barkat. He was the mayor of Jerusalem. He seems successful. So if he decides to move and try to sideline Netanyahu, that could have a big effect. I don't see it happening in the next year or so, but we'll see. So a lot of factors, hard to guess, but I would, if I had to put my money somewhere now, I'd say like the government is formed and we should give it at least a year. We should give it a year. But there's going to be Sheikh Jarrah, there's going to be, I hope not another round of fighting in Gaza. There are going to be some issues that are going to make it this is a very rocky road. The atmosphere, I must say that there's such fatigue in Israel of politics. Obviously in Tel Aviv and others, there's in many circles that really want to see Netanyahu go. There's happiness, there's a change. A lot of people understand the irony of this. You'll hear people, left-wing people saying, if I'm rooting for a government headed by Naftali Bennett, something must be really wrong in this world. On the other hand, you have a public that is afraid of losing their center of gravity. And I think, the group in the Israeli population that's probably going to be mostly affected initially is the Haredi community, because everyone that's against the Haredi monopoly over budgets and their, let's say, unproportional share of rights versus sort of burden. All of them are together in the government and they're out. So that's what I'm seeing from where where you sit is where you stand, but this is where things are.
Right, and just to clarify, the Haredi being the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, which has typically aligned with the right. There's a lot to unpack. Thad, I want to ask you to certainly feel free to comment on your general impressions of this this new change government. But I want to ask you specifically about the Palestinian citizens in Israel and their role, particularly given the place that Mansour Abbas and the Ram Party, or the United Arab List, have secured in this as part of this coalition. It's interesting that they're part of the ruling coalition, but they're not in the government. They don't. There aren't, as far as I've seen, any ministries that they will get. So what does this mean for the 21% of Israelis who are Palestinian? Does this mean that the Ram Party is now the most important Arab political force in Israel, or even kind of the de facto political leaders of this community? And also, if you could tell us, why did the Ram join this government? What are they getting in return? And how is it being perceived in the broader Palestinian community, which I should point out you are yourself a member of, so you have a particular insight there. And if you could, and I know I'm adding a lot here, but if you could also tell us, where does this leave the rest of Palestinian politics in Israel, particularly Ayman Odeh and the Joint List?
Sure. So there's a lot to unpack there. I'll begin by giving my general thoughts, and then I'll dive deeper into the Arab community. So first of all, I agree with you. Thank you for having me, first of all. I agree with you that it's important to point out that Netanyahu still has, they tend to call him the magician, right? That he might still have some tricks up his sleeves that until it's sealed and dealed by Sunday afternoon, we should keep that option open that something could happen. Albeit as time progresses and more members of the coalition have come out and publicly supported this new government, it seems that Netanyahu's chances of pulling something is diminishing by the minute. But I do agree that this is going to be a very fragile government. It's really hard to give it a deadline. But I personally would be this is the best bet I could give you. I would be surprised if we reach the rotation phase. So the rotation phase is supposed to happen in August of 2023. That's when Yair Lapid is supposed to become prime minister. I highly doubt we'll get there because, again, this is a very fragile coalition, and for a multitude of reasons. It's not only the conflict, which I guess it's clear why we have so many divisions regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but even regarding internal politics in Israel. Take, for example, the economy. So on the one hand, you have the Labor Party, which is to a large extent a social democrat party, or tries to emulate the social democrats in Western Europe. But at the same time, we have Gideon Sa'ar's New Hope Party, which is trying to hold the baton of, I guess, what in the United States you'd call fiscal responsibility, or the whole small government ideology in economics. You have the new Prime Minister, Naftali Bennett. His party has even, been identified with even some libertarian economic policies over the last few years. And they came out with an economic plan, which they call the Singapore Plan, which is extremely right-wing in economic terms. So how will that, coexist with the Labor Party? There are going to be many, what I guess in Hebrew we call minds, ahead of this coalition regarding economic policy. If you take the issue of religion and state, which is a very big issue in Israel that over time is only going to grow, in my opinion. You have on the one side Meretz, which is supposed to represent the secular Western values of Israel, or these values that at least Israeli Foreign Ministry likes to promote to the international community. But at the same time, you have Naftali Bennett's party, which is not an ultra-Orthodox party, but nonetheless, the whole idea of the Jewish state, a strong Jewish religious identity, is something in the core of what they believe in. And when these two forces are going to collide, how are you going to overcome these issues? And then you have the issue of minority rights. I mean, you have the United Arab List on the one hand, but then we have Avigdor Lieberman on the other hand, not to mention all the other not all the other members. I mean, just today it came out that Benny Gantz, the defense minister, wants to introduce a bill to the Knesset that would allow taking Arab citizens of Israel into custody in jails in the West Bank, okay? So if that, now this is not a bill that is being proposed by the government, this is something that Benny Gantz himself is promoting at the moment. But what if that comes to a vote and somehow the government supports it? That will put Mansour Abbas and the UAL in a very weird dilemma. And I think that would be a good move for us to talk a little bit about Mansour Abbas and the UAL. I think for Mansour Abbas, it's a zero-sum game. It's either that he's going to succeed phenomenally, or he's going to fail miserably. There is no middle path for him because of the expectations that has been put on him on the one hand, that he on the one hand has put, but also his nemesis within the Arab community, particularly, and the joint list have put on him. Now, what exactly is the coalition deal? It's basically support for the government in return for budgets. And on paper, it's actually a lot of money. We're talking about nearly 50 billion shekels over 10 years. So that's about 5 billion shekels a year. Right now, the main plan that Netanyahu came up with that he was promoting and was so proud about was 15 billion shekels during his tenureship. Now we're talking about 50 billion. Now it needs to be implemented, which in itself is a huge issue. Whether that will happen or not, we're going to have to wait and see. But that was the main promise, and that's not by chance. Arab citizens, the Palestinian community in Israel is discriminated against in almost all walks of life. But the most clear policies that for the everyday Arab citizen or the everyday Arab voter, if you wish, can see comes from budgeting. We have a huge problem when it comes to our local councils. I think about 80% of them are suffering financially. Over 80% actually have unbalanced budgets, so to speak. We have problems regarding transportation infrastructure. We have problems, we don't have institutions that are tax collecting institutions, such as like in the Jewish community. So we don't have industrial zones that bring in money to Arab local councils. We do not have government institutions in Arab towns that also bring in taxes into these towns. And these, and according to these agreements, they're supposed to bring in lots and lots and lots of money. Now, Mansour Abbas's main problem is that, well, first of all, Israel has not had a budget for the last 2 years. We've just got out of the whole Corona situation. I don't think austerity is the correct word, but Israel is definitely going to be facing a lot of economic challenges over the next year or two. So will the government really be able to invest economically in the Arab community when it's having all of these different economic challenges that it will be facing? So that's a big question for Mansour Abbas. And he knows that the joint list, and since you asked about the joint list are going to be waiting for him to fail on this issue. And then there's also the other issue here that we're not only talking about civic issues, but what about the national issues? One of the things that Mansour Abbas has done is that he has put aside the whole national discourse, or if you wish, nationalist discourse to the side. He did not want to, quote unquote, provoke the right-wing elements within this new government, so he has not talked about these issues. But one of the issues that has become very clear through the unfortunate events that we witnessed in May, both between Gaza and Israel, but also inside Israel, is that it's really hard to disconnect the nationalist issues from everyday lives of the Arab citizens in Israel. It looks like Arab-Jewish rapprochement within Israel per se is really hard to take. It's something that's going to be really hard to materialize as long as the occupation is there, as long as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is there, because you're always, again, these mines, whether it's the Al-Aqsa Mosque, whether it's Sheikh Jarrah and evictions, whether it's all these different potential issues that can explode in the face of any kind of Arab-Jewish cooperation. So Mansour Abbas is going to have to be very careful. But if he will succeed, in passing, again, these mines on the one hand, getting a lot of the budgets that he was promised, I think he will be able to revolutionize Arab-Palestinian politics inside Israel. And he can become not only the new leader of the community, but he will be basically showing the path forward for future generations of Arab leaders and the different Arab parties in Israel.
Thanks, Tahir. It's a pretty high bar that has been established for Ram and for Mansour Abbas to succeed. But then again, there was a time when people like Naftali Bennett said, had called Mansour Abbas a terror supporter, and Avigdor Lieberman had said he would never sit in a government with an Arab party. So. Obviously, you can never say never in the context of Israeli politics. So, turning to you, Paul, obviously, I want to hear your thoughts on the viability of this government, but also if you could maybe shed some light on what you see are the particular issues or factors that are likely to determine whether this government stays intact or falls. Is it rockets from Gaza? Is it expulsions in Sheikh Jarrah that could provoke either defections from the left or from the right? What are these things that are coming down the pike, like the Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan evictions? What are they likely to do to this government?
Well, I'm starting from a slightly different point in that I think it's important and even positive that the government simply can't, by its own rules, deal with the existential issues that we always think of, war and peace. What sort of self-determination for Palestinians, synagogue and state, the place of Judaism in the Jewish state. Instead, the only things they can deal with are things that do affect everyone's lives in a more mundane way. As Tahir mentioned, there hasn't been a budget in 2 years. That means not only work for accountants, that means that every department is working under the budget allocation of 2 years ago. This is before the pandemic. All of the things, the infrastructure, the criminal violence running rampant in Arab communities, the repairing relations with the United States. These are all the things that have partisan elements to them, but I think can also be addressed if there is the will in a more non-partisan way. And in a strange way, I'm hoping, and we have no idea if this will even start being the case, but it's possible that the last few years, the process of getting rid of the or at least the opposing him for the moment, will provide a certain impetus for these disparate groups to get together. And I have no historical evidence to go by because I'm a historian. I can't think of anything like this in Western or any history. There is no precedent for it. So I think it's very it's possible, I wouldn't say very, that the fear of going to a new election, of perhaps getting back, may mitigate the partisan urges of members from different constituencies. And knowing on the one hand that every single vote counts, that perhaps one could be substituted for. But if two or three leave, the government collapses. Traditionally, that has meant extortion by the small parties. In this case, we have almost only or primarily small parties. And the question is whether if one of them pulls the plug, will they be blamed? So I can imagine that it may work for a while in dealing with the day-to-day things, and whether it can deal with a real crisis. Does Hamas want the government to succeed or fail? I don't think Hamas wants a war, and I think it will try to avoid a situation for it. I think the last war last month was largely provoked by utterly incompetent policing and policies. And the question is whether those in charge now will try to avoid provocation. That's the optimistic scenario. I don't rule out at all even some problem before Sunday. I think it's unlikely, but I'm hoping, against hope perhaps, for a sense of responsibility that hasn't been seen really on any side in Israeli politics, and is somewhat absent in world politics now.
Thanks, Paul. If I could stay with you for a minute, I want to turn to Washington and the Biden administration. As you know, there is some historical animosity between the current Democratic administration and Prime Minister Netanyahu, much of it going back to the days of Barack Obama, the Obama-Biden administration. At the same time, Biden has expressed, his at least friendship with Prime Minister Netanyahu. So, where do you think that the Biden administration falls in terms of this new government? Are they going to welcome Netanyahu's departure as sort of a cog in the wheel, someone who's been very obstructionist on moving forward on a two-state solution? And how are they going to deal with someone as far to the right as Naftali Bennett as prime minister, if in fact they're concerned about a two-state solution?
I can't imagine anyone in the Biden administration not cheering privately that Bibi is going. I think for any number of reasons, not only the friendship between Trump and the animosity between the Obama administration and the just getting rid of him, I think will have a positive effect. And now the question that no one can answer is which Bennet will we get? Is it the ideological Bennet who sees annexation as an absolute imperative? Well, if that's who comes to office, I don't think the government will last long. The effect is, as frequently been pointed out, Biden doesn't have a high expectation, doesn't expect a two-state solution in the immediate future. Nobody does. So the new government's imperative to put these questions on hold, I think will fit the Biden administration very well. And I think a lot, or probably most of the new government are somewhat appalled at Bibi's flipping off the United States the way he has repeatedly. So I think it will be an imperative on both sides to try to repair relations without, in effect, accomplishing very much towards any ultimate peace settlement.
Thanks, Paul. Thad, I want to put to you as well as to Shira this question of which Naftali Bennett are we going to see? But let's start with Thad. As you know, Bennett has categorically rejected the idea of a two-state solution. At least Netanyahu would pay lip service to it on some level. I don't think there's any expectation by this administration or others that Bennett would verbally commit to a two-state solution, even aspirationally. And he's been he's even called the idea of a Palestinian state national suicide for Israel. And he's a supporter of annexing up to 60% of the West Bank. So does this new government, is it in a way a sign that Israel, and because of its diversity and because it has basically suppressed these national and nationalist issues in order to stay together, is it a sign that Israel is now officially post two-state solution, that we kind of turn that corner and everyone seems to be moving on from the left to the right? And also, if you could tell us, what do you expect? How will this government deal with these issues like settlements? I mean, it's not hard to imagine if they're too aggressive on settlements, it could bring the government down. If they're not aggressive enough, maybe it'll bring the government down. So what do you expect that we'll see on things like settlement activity, evictions, and so forth?
So I agree with you that that's the million-dollar question. I mean, how will Naftali Bennett behave? What kind of image is he going to show the world? Is it going to be the Naftali Bennett that we got to see from, the Mehdi Hassan interviews over the years, where he talks in biblical terms about the land of Israel and includes a lot of insults towards the Palestinians, both as a national movement, but also towards the Palestinian people as a collective? Or are we going to see a different Naftali Bennett who's going to be more diplomatic? I mean, time will only be able to tell us. I think that Israel, while the Biden administration will be happy to see Netanyahu go, I think Israel's problems, Israel's, let's call them Hasbara problems, are not only with the White House. I mean, as we saw in the last round of events in May, Israel's starting to have problems with people like Senator Bob Menendez and Chuck Schumer, and even Andrew Yang, who's running for mayor of New York, had to backtrack some pro-Israel statements that he made because the Democratic Party is shifting. I would say Israel's biggest problem is actually in the Jewish community, especially young, non-Orthodox Jews. That's where a lot of Israel's problems are coming from. And you know, Netanyahu purposely has neglected these communities in favor of other communities, such as the evangelical community. Even though a poll that came out by, I think it was UNC, University of North Carolina, just a month ago showed that even among young evangelicals, Israel is starting to suffer, its popularity is starting to suffer, so to speak. So Naftali Bennett has a lot of work to do with you know, Israeli Hasbara in general, with explaining Israel's points. If he behaves in the way he did when he was just a minister, then obviously he's going to make life much more easier for Palestinian Hasbara, if I can use that word. So I do expect that he will be more diplomatic, but at the same time, he's going to have to be sensitive towards his right-wing base in Israel, because he's already being accused by many right-wing ideologues of, you know, compromising and what up. So it's that balance that he's going to have to somehow try and create, and that will be to a large extent is going to legitimize his position within the hardcore of the right wing in Israel. Regarding policy per se, I think this is going to be a status quo government. It's also going to be a status quo government because the environment, the general environment regarding the peace process and the actors who are involved in this conflict is an environment of status quo. I mean, on the one hand, you have the Palestinian leadership, both in the West Bank and Gaza, that do not incentivize Israel to change her behavior in that sense. On the one hand, you have Abu Mazen and the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, who are cooperating with Israel. Many Palestinians would say collaborating rather than cooperating with Israel on security issues. But in return, they're not receiving any dividends, any serious dividends towards independence or greater autonomy or whatever it is. So, you know, the leadership in the West Bank is giving Israel all these free, so to speak, free goodies, but in return, they're not getting anything. And then you have Hamas on the other hand, which, you know, is not really, this whole mukawama, this whole resistance is not really succeeding in changing the status quo vis-a-vis Israel and Gaza. If anything, it only makes life in Gaza much worse, and it actually helps Israel with the international community because, you know, when push comes to shove, Hamas is a very unpopular organization in the international community. We saw that Hamas was used even to legitimize the Abraham Accords, you know, in the name of fighting extremism in the region that even brought Arab countries close to Israel. So if Hamas doesn't change its behavior and try to deal with Israel differently, that would also make, you know, life for Israel a little bit more comfortable on this front. And also then you have the United States, the other actor here, which, you know, even though things are changing in the United States, the discourse is changing. When it comes to elite level politics, things aren't really changing that much. As long as Israel is going to be backed up, the Israeli government, that is being backed up by the United States government, Israel will not have an incentive to change either. So all of these issues, in my opinion, will only strengthen the status quo. And I guess Naftali Bennett, especially for his 2 years in the premiership, he's going to try and maintain as hard as possible the status quo. He's also seen that, and this is something important, and I guess we'll talk about Netanyahu later on, but one of the reasons why Netanyahu has been so successful, at least electorally, is his ability to maintain the status quo. On the one hand, he did not, you know, compromise with the Palestinians the way he was forced to in the 1990s. But at the same time, Israel's at least this is the general feeling in Israel, you know, security-wise, things are going well, right? I mean, in the last few years, not many Israelis have been killed because of the conflict. I think the number of Israelis who died in car accidents in 1 month is equal to the number of Israelis who were killed from the conflict between 2014 and 2021, between the two wars. That we had with Gaza. So that alone kind of shows you how much the conflict is a non-issue in Israel today, that even left-wing parties do not put it at the center stage of their agenda. So Naftali Bennett is going to try and maintain the status quo as much as possible. You know, if he could add in a few settlers here and there, more projects in the settlements, maybe. But generally speaking, I do not expect a massive expanding of settler activity over the next 4 years. This is a status quo government.
Thanks, Thad. Shira, if I could come to you on this this question of the internal situation in Israel, and particularly between the various factions of the right wing, the pro-Bibi and anti-Bibi wings of the right, so to speak. Obviously, Netanyahu has not, and the Likud have not dealt with the loss very well. I mean, we've you know, Thad and Paul have alluded to the kinds of hyperbole, the threats that are being directed at Yamina and other right-wing parties that are part of this this coalition. They're being called traitors and collaborators. They're receiving death threats. They've even been assigned security detail. All of this is happening in an environment where Israel's politics are clearly have been moving to the right, even to the point of legitimizing and normalizing Kahanists who used to be banned from the Knesset and are now part of the Knesset. And of course, we remember just a few weeks ago the march of Kahanists in Jerusalem that sort of wreaked havoc. Many of us remember the climate also that existed in Israel around Prime Minister Rabin's assassination. Is there something to fear there? I mean, is this something that ordinary Israelis are concerned about? And is it something that the international community should fear as well? Is there a risk of seeing something similar to what we saw in 1995?
I'll respond really briefly to this, and then maybe I can just go back to a little bit of the issues that Paul and Thar spoke about. Everyone is sort of anticipating a murder, an assassination. There's the talk that something bad is going to happen, and certainly can happen. I don't know if it's going to be a politician. It could be a journalist, right? It could be an activist. It could be something else. The violence that occurred just a couple of weeks ago within the Green Line, I think was shocking to many people who live here, right? So you can understand the atmosphere, the problems, the fact that you try to ignore the problems. And it's interesting because, there were, I'm speaking to you from Tel Aviv, there were rockets on Tel Aviv just a couple of weeks ago. I mean, the hardest thing to do, sort of as we were getting towards a ceasefire, was to get a seat at to get a table at a restaurant in Tel Aviv. This is how this country is, right? You're like in the Nile, you bury your head in the sand until something bad happens. This goes back to the status quo, right? This is why the status quo remains, or at least part of the reason. On the Israeli public moving more to the right, it's very difficult in a crazy political fragmented system like Israel to speak about right and left. Because I think you speak about Naftali Bennett and he would say, oh, I'm liberal on economic issues, I'm liberal, he's not against the LGBT, right? He's only hawkish on the Palestinian issue. I would even say he's hawkish on, the Iranian issue. Netanyahu was sort of like the right-wing person. He was, for a long time, we could speak about it, actively arranging for cash to Hamas. And it's not just like the Qatari money got to Hamas, you know, those suitcases of cash did not arrive themselves from Ben Gurion Airport. It's actively the Netanyahu's policy, handing over cash to people during COVID in ways that the Democrats in the US would only dream of doing, right? So I'm saying like this is the representative of the right. So it's hard to speak about right and left. And Naftali Bennett is going to be prime minister, although he got 5% of the votes. So the Itamar Ben-Gvir's, yeah, it's true, they're in the government, but most of the public don't support them. Just the problem is most of the public is really indifferent. If you look at different public opinion polls, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is not an issue at all. And we saw it also even during the annexation threat, which I think was pretty credible at the time last summer. It wasn't something the public was concerned about, but I think the public, like the ideology, sort of is dead in terms of right and left and what you make of it traditionally. But certainly, you know, something bad, violent can happen, and can happen soon, unfortunately. But you know, I just want to speak about this government for a second in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Iranian issue and in the context of the Biden administration. It's really important, and I agree with Paul 100%. I don't think anyone's going to shed a tear that Netanyahu is ending his term, right? There's going to be a new government, and I think there's understanding in Washington that they're going to have a hard time because this mishmash of ideologies coming together. There are two positives that I see to this. First of all, neither Naftali Bennett nor Yair Lapid nor anyone else in this government wants to pick a fight with the US. So you're not going to see anyone going to Congress trying to derail a return to the JCPOA, to the nuclear agreement with Iran. And also, as Yair said, on the settlement issue, I think they're going to be much more careful. There's a message here also to the US. Instead of, I think they should have cut Israel. You know, it's better if they don't hold back and say like, oh, let this government form, and we don't want to be asking things of this government because they're just starting and it's so fragile, so dangerous. No, I think it's actually the time for the US to come up with actual policies and requests, and maybe even not red lines. I don't like the use of red lines, but saying like what they're expecting within the political reality that we're in. And there's no one's going to go for negotiations on a two-state solution at the moment for a variety of reasons. And Naftali Bennett is very limited in what he can do in Area C, which is 60% of the West Bank, and which is under where most of the settlers live, and which he was the first one calling to annex. On the other hand, there's a lot that he can do in areas A and B. And I know could argue what can we do there, but there's a lot on the economic front that can be done. There's a lot on the security front that can be done. I am not endorsing this as an end state. I don't think, you know, at the end of the day, you want to lift the occupation. But can this government, on the one hand, be the advantage of this government that it can be prevented from doing really bad things, right? It can't annex anything. Hopefully, it can't go out of, you know, it can't, I hope it's not going to strike in Iran or do anything like that. And on the other hand, can it do modest, good things, partially also to really reward the PA, strengthen the PA in ways that everyone's talking about it, but no one is actually doing it. And there are concrete things that can be done, and you need to find this Venn diagram between the little that the U.S. Biden administration wants to invest in this topic, and what this coalition can do. And I think there's actually a lot. So I am, if the stars aligned in a way that everyone is willing to do it, we can see some positives. And I'm never positive on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Sadly, you're in good company there, I think, on that point. So we have just a few minutes left that I want to give you each a chance to make any closing points that you have. I'm going to start with you, Paul. You know, obviously, you can make any additional comments, but I wanted to ask you specifically about the Israeli left. Is there a future for the Israeli left? Is this coalition conducive towards, you know, give the left some accomplishments and something that they can take back to, you know, maybe even expand their constituency? Or is Israel sort of on this inevitable rightward march, in terms of its politics? In 2 or 3 minutes, if you could.
I frankly think the left gets very little out of the coalition except getting rid of the which is its main single goal. I think if they will have the most incentive, perhaps after a year or two, to leave and present an alternative. But I don't think anyone should expect in the next 4 or 8 years in this decade a new left to rise as we see in this country. I think Israelis are still in many ways traumatized from both this war and the second Intifada. And I think this is true of Arabs and Jewish Israelis. So I don't see the left taking power any time in the next few years.
Thanks, Paul. There's a question directed at you about Mansour Abbas's decision to join this coalition. How is he explaining this to his constituency, to his block of voters? And obviously, feel free to make any closing remarks that you have as well.
Good question. Mansour Abbas has led really what I guess you could call a civic argument, in the sense that he's focused almost entirely on civic issues, and that's not by chance. The polls show that the overwhelming majority of Arab citizens want their legislative leadership, their leadership in parliament at least, to focus on civic issues. And in Israel's political culture, the only way you can get achievements in that front is by being part of a coalition. So polls have shown that 70% and even more than 70% of Arab voters want their leadership to take part in government. So in that case, he's talking to the convinced, if shall we speak. The Arab community largely is on his side, not on Ayman Odeh's side of this debate. However, historically, people have had a problem with right-wing governments, and nobody expected him to be under Naftali Bennett out of all people. But what made it easier for Abbas, or what made it more legitimate for Abbas to do that, was the saga that happened last year in March of 2020. So if we go back to the third election, which happened in March of 2020, the center left, led by Benny Gantz, was able to form a 62-vote government with the Arab parties. However, it was Benny Gantz's party that refused at the end of the day. They preferred to make a deal with Netanyahu, in which they are the junior partner, rather than form a coalition with the Arab parties and Benny Gantz becoming prime minister for 4 full years. And that made a huge backlash within the Arab community. It angered many people, and it proved to everybody that, this argument that Abbas made, for them, we're Arabs. It doesn't matter, right, Zionist right, Zionist left, for them, we will always be Arab. So why not, deal with the right wing in Israel as well? So the saga that happened last year kind of legitimized working with the right wing, and Mansour Abbas very cleverly, I would say, took advantage of that. I just want to add one more thing that Paul talked about, because I'm incorporating this actually into my dissertation. That's about the Israeli left. I agree with Paul. The trauma of the second Intifada, the failure of the peace process, destroyed the left in Israel. But I would also argue that demographic changes within Israel have also destroyed the left in Israel. In Israel, there's a very strong correlation between, on the one hand, ethnic background and voting for left and right, and also levels of religiosity and voting for left and right. And in Israel, the groups that are growing demographically are those that, from an ethnic perspective, tend to vote for right wing, and for religious reasons, Israel is growing in its levels of religiosity. Meaning, demographically speaking, it's the right wing that's growing. So, in my dissertation, at least, I argued that the best way for the left to come back to power in Israel is by changing the dynamics from a left-right dynamic in Israel, or left-right dichotomy, sorry, to a liberal versus conservative dichotomy in Israel, especially with the growth, the demographic growth of the ultra-Orthodox community. We are starting to see many people in Israel who are part of the right wing begin to adapt a more liberal, shall we say, or secular discourse. The best example is Avigdor Lieberman's party, which has moved now to the other side. Mainly, the Avigdor Lieberman's excuse was mainly because of the growing power of the ultra-Orthodox community within the government. I think there are also many secular right-wing groups that are not very comfortable with the growth of the religious right in Israel in general. So I think unless the left wing is able to change its discourse from, a more traditional left wing discourse to a more, let's call it liberal, secular / even capitalist discourse, the way Yair Lapid is doing, then maybe they will be able to come back to power. But other than that, not in the foreseeable future.
Thanks. Shira, you're going to have the last word, and I want to put to you a question that we have from someone in our audience that's a little bit down in the weeds, and then give you a chance to make any closing points that you'd like to make. So if you had to pick one and only one electoral reform to stabilize Israeli politics, what would it be? And there are a number of ideas that are thrown out, like raising the threshold, the electoral threshold to 5 or even 10%, eliminating incentives for parties to split and for MKs to switch parties, adding regional or / district voting, going back to direct elections for the prime minister. What ideas would you have? And then please feel free to respond to any points that have been made or any final thoughts you had.
Yeah. It's difficult because everyone's trying to play with those different instruments, right, to increase stability. There was a direct election for prime minister, and it didn't work. Raising the threshold got us to a situation. It was actually, ironically, right, it was Avigdor Lieberman's initiative, because it's trying to limit Arab, what they call Arab, right, Palestinian, 48 Palestinian citizens of Israel, representation in the Knesset, but then they got a very big list because they unified. The problem is that when you do it, parties could come together, but then disintegrate right after form a coalition. So it's very difficult to deal with this fragmentation. Reducing the incentives could be an interesting angle. There's also a lot of talks about, and this really gets into the weed, but there's a lot of talk about having kind of a meso layer between the central government and the municipalities. I spoke about it a little bit. It's a very small country. There are, I think, if I'm not mistaken, there are like 270 municipalities in Israel, cities and towns. And one of the reasons is that you have the center of the country that's doing pretty well, and then you have the periphery. It's the Arab cities and towns which are highly representative in the poor ones, but also the Haredi. It's not exactly ultra-Orthodox, right? It's not just the Haredi. It's also speaks about the occupation or the lack of this public. And I think American ultra-Orthodox don't like to be called, the Haredis are called ultra-Orthodox, so I'm being sensitive to this. It could be interesting if you add this meso layer. It's kind of like a district level, which would reduce sort of how much power the central government in Israel has, which is really unprecedented. And everyone understands that there's a need to go in that direction anyway. About the left, I'd be curious reading Tahir's dissertation. I think it's smart to frame it in conservative and liberal. I think we saw examples of this, not just Avigdor Lieberman, who is really secular. So the religious part is not, it's not about this. It's also coming from a former Soviet country, which is a whole different mindset. But it's anything that's left is bad. But you saw it. I think what was remarkable. The Jerusalem Post, a conservative paper with an editor-in-chief, proudly wearing yarmulke, conservative, religious. they took a very tough stance on the Haredi community during COVID. Very tough stance in ways that were very visible. So I think it's smart to go in that way. The left will have to do, the left will have to go a long way and stop being embarrassed about being left. I think I'm very happy. I think if it's successful, I'm happy with Mansour Abbas getting the legitimacy of being in the coalition. But ironically, it's Netanyahu that created this situation. Netanyahu had to bring him on. It's a failure of my camp, our camp. The left was so afraid, right? The left and center was so afraid of going with the Arabs and saying, no, this is 21% of the public. And frankly, we have more in common with many of you than we have with the Haredi community in Nasharim, and we should work together. Instead, letting things like the national state bill and other things that sort of like formal discrimination occur. And I hope that we'll start seeing a change.
Thank you. So we are now a little bit over time, but I think well worth it, just given the richness of this discussion. Thank you to our three incredible panelists, Shira Efron, Thaer Aburas, Paul Sham, and thank you all for joining today's conversation, and we hope to see you back at our next event. Good